How has IBM attempted to disrupt the healthcare sector? Well, funnily enough, it comes back to an episode of Jeopardy. A doctor at a hospital in Florida told the company this product was a piece of... Welcome back to the Crossover Connections with Jack Wang Podcast. My name is Jack. I'm a scientist and college professor at an Australian university. And when we predict the future, one of the most reliable ways of doing that is to look into the past. In 2011, IBM had a computer called Watson, and this was its version of artificial intelligence. It wasn't sentient, but it was probably the most sophisticated version of AI people had seen up until that time in 2011. And they sent Watson onto the American quiz show Jeopardy and asked Watson to compete against two of the show's most successful contestants televised nationally. Watson won comfortably, leading one of the opponents, Ken Jennings, to say, "I, for one, welcome our new computer overlords." IBM's plans were very ambitious and wanted to use Watson, train it with all of the healthcare data, all of the patient records that were made available electronically over decades, and it wants to use Watson to transform the healthcare sector because IBM invested billions and billions of dollars. Another attempt of infusing data into medicine, thinking you're going to crack the case wide open. All of these famous figures in history trying to use data to transform medicine, they keep coming up against the bottleneck that there is not enough data to really capture the complexity of the human condition, certainly not medically. And every time you think you've got the entire picture, you try and make a prediction, you come up short. And if we come back to Watson and IBM, came up so short despite $5 billion of acquisitions and trying to obtain companies and patient data. It was sold for parts. IBM sold Watson to try and recoup some of their losses and essentially moved on. They thought it was not worth their time. You could see the appeal for someone like IBM because there's a tremendous amount of information collected every day when you're caring for patients, hundreds of millions of people. And right now, all of those patient records, every time you go see a GP, no country has got an amazing database that catalogs all of these things, and one doctor really has to manually send over patient records to another doctor that's also consulting on your case. It's still a very manual process, and there is no one system that talks to and aggregates all of that patient data, to my understanding. In fact, if a company came in pitching this as a solution, I think all the governments would be very nervous about one company having access to all of the medical records in one single place. IBM made a bid for this about 10 years ago, and they spent, as I said, over $5 billion trying to do so. And the idea was that Watson would be able to aggregate all of this information and very reliably make predictions that clinicians would find useful, and IBM could then sell this technology to all the hospitals in the US and across the world and make a killing and a return on investment on their $5 billion. People in the technology sector looked at the lack of connectivity in the healthcare sector and said, we're going to fix it. But of course, they have to date not been able to fix it. And the most attractive part for big tech is that it is one of the biggest parts of any country's economy, and tech companies are drawn to audacious challenges like this. Go big or go home. Disrupt or be disrupted is Silicon Valley's mantra. IBM needed massive amounts of data to train Watson, and they kept acquiring different companies, Truven, Fitel, Explorers, and kept merging, looking at insurance databases, electronic health records with 50 million patients. They kept thinking they would get to a point where enough data is enough, and Watson would become so good at reconciling all of this information. Unbelievably, it's still not enough data. Patients were not getting recommendations that were relevant, and it was suggesting a kind of treatment that wasn't available in the locality, or the recommendation did not square with the treatment protocols that were used in a local institution or in the US and Europe. And this is the big one. Physicians were feeling like the algorithm, Watson, was not telling them something they didn't already know. And that is the big gap. You have to convince the end user that you as a tool are of value to them. And if you can't convince the end user, doctors, that this tool is valuable in healthcare, it will never take off and will never be valuable. And I think it still comes back to not having enough data, which is staggering. You think having 50 million patient samples, that will be enough. But we have billions of people on the planet with a lot more diversity baked into our genetics than that. 50 million people is not enough. And certainly the data they were collecting on 50 million people was not sophisticated enough to train these tool sets. It got to a point where an internal IBM presentation from 2017, a doctor at a hospital in Florida told the company this product was a piece of... and circulated amongst IBM executives the fact that they were very aware of how poorly this was going. Despite all the efforts they tried to rescue it, the sunk cost fallacy got them in the end. They still decided to move on. Even with 7,000 employees, they decided to sell. Thank you for listening. I'm Jack. Hope to connect with you again next time around.